Hello and welcome to Busboys and Poets. This is our 20th anniversary, and we're bringing back authors we love, people that we think have made a difference in the world. And with us tonight is Tim Wise. Tim Wise is author, activist, and educator. He writes about anti-racism, white privilege, systemic racism, and the dismantling of institutional inequity in the United States. He's a self-described angry white male, and author of several books, including his best-selling memoir, White Like Me, a personal account examining white privilege and racism in American society through his own personal experiences. I'd like to welcome you to Busboys and Poets virtually, Tim.
Thank you, Andy. I'm so sorry that I can't be there with you in person. As I'm sure you and others who will be watching this can imagine, things are a little tight right now for all of us who do the kind of work that I do. And there's been a new, sort of stream of threats aimed at me, and I didn't want to put myself or you all in the line of fire of any of that, literally or figuratively. So, but it's good that we have this mechanism, and we can still, reach people and tell the truth and talk about the important things. So it's an honor to be with you.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to have you. So let's dive right in with what's happening, and one of the reasons why we were going to plan to do this in person, and then you, like many other authors who speak about this issue, have been receiving threats of all kinds. So obviously the elephant in the room is Charlie Kirk. And, many things have happened since his untimely death or killing, I should say. We've had, Jimmy Kimmel canceled for saying something really, really mild. Last night, we had with us Karen Attiah from the Washington Post, who just basically said, I can't really uplift white males at this point because as a Black woman, he was speaking disparagingly about Black women, calling them less intelligent and not really qualified. And so she said, don't count me in as one of those people that's going to be raising his flag. And right. So for that, she was fired. Right. And it's quite shocking. So what is this phenomenon? I mean, most people hardly have heard of Charlie Kirk, unless you're in his sphere, which was large. Let's be honest. A lot of people had not heard of Charlie Kirk. I've listened to him maybe twice and it's usually just snippets. I don't like what he says because I think he brings out vitriol and hate, racist, and really incites people to violence in a sense. So, what is this phenomenon? What's happening, Tim?
I wish that fewer people had known who he was, and that he'd been less influential than he was. But I'm going to be very clear. I've been doing this work as an activist and educator for a long time. I've been on the left and the progressive side of the aisle for my entire adult life, and really going back before I was an adult, to be honest. And I've never seen someone who was as effective on the right as an activist or organizer, even though he wasn't an organizer in the way we on the left think of organizing. He's sort of an influencer era type organizer backed by a lot of rich white man money, is what brought him to prominence, starting when he was, a late teenager, early 20s. And he had a lot of influence and a lot of reach. And you see people all around the country right now who are acting as if, and they're referring to him as sort of their MLK, which is particularly offensive given his own views about MLK, which was that Dr. King was a horrible person. The Civil Rights Act was a mistake, all of these things. So I think what's happening, a couple of things. I mean, number one, there's an opportunistic bad faith effort on the part of people like the president, whose, bad faith is his body wash for the most part. Everything he does is bad faith. Stephen Miller, people like that, who are frankly, and I think despicably, using the horrific murder of somebody they claim to be a friend to push an agenda that they already were planning. I mean, all you have to do, if you read Project 2025, all of the things that they're now threatening to do: defund the left, go after the foundations that fund the left. There was an executive order in January, just within a day or two of the inauguration, that talked about identifying not just colleges that they thought were funding DEI or whatever, contributing to leftist beliefs, but also foundations, which now they've re-upped their attack on foundations. So it's all very opportunistic. It's all very Reichstag fire. It's all very, very much in that tradition of never letting, the opportunity to use a crisis for your own gain pass. And I honestly think it's sort of disgusting And I'd like to think Charlie Kirk would find it disgusting, although I don't really know. I mean, using someone's murder to push that kind of crackdown on your political opponents is itself despicable. So that's part of what it is. The other part of what it is, and this amazed me, and because I did know who Charlie Kirk was, and I did suffer through a lot of clips of him talking about things in a particularly racist and sexist and transphobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, just generally all these things, all the ways, all the things. And but I was stunned that most people, a lot of people, didn't know the breadth and depth of those views. I figured everyone would understand. So when people started lionizing him, I'm like, wait, but he said this and this and this. And then what I discovered after I was writing some stuff about that, posting some things about that, how many people never saw the clips that maybe you and I saw, and a lot of other progressive-minded people saw. I was hearing from people, and I actually stumbled upon a Facebook post by someone who wasn't actually in my network, but because one of my friends had posted on her page, I guess it came across my feed. And what she was saying was that she had a friend she was talking to about Charlie Kirk's assassination or murder, whatever we want to call it. And the friend had only seen clips of him, these very anodyne, sort of banal clips about, find your purpose in life and do something good in the world, and almost like TED Talk, inspirational, speaker kind of stuff. And because her friend had only seen that, while she, the person posting this, had seen all the other stuff, she realized, and then that helped me realize, wow, we live in two, if not more, entirely different universes of information. And so what that led me to realize is, as much as I can, and I think we should critique the things Charlie Kirk said, we have to have a little bit of grace for some of the normies, as the young folks call them out there, who they're not really keyed into politics. They're not really keyed into anything right or left, who just think, oh my God, this Christian man who just wanted to go have debates on college campuses got murdered. How terrible is it? Well, of course it's terrible. I think we can all say, and I hope we can, and if not, I would criticize anyone who can't condemn murder. But the idea that that's all he was, that he was just this good Christian family man who wanted to go have debates on campuses. If you believe that, of course, you're going to be horrified when some of us are not mourning. It's not that we're not mourning. I mourn for his children. I mourn for his family. I mourn for the people that loved him. It's terrible. But the fact that we're not lionizing him, if you think he was just a good Christian man, you're like, well, why are you criticizing him? But then what this woman said was, when she showed her friend some of the clips that she was familiar with, but that her friend was not, her friend was horrified. She's like, oh my God, I had no idea he believed those things. So what it says to me is that what's happening is A, exploitation by the president and his minions of this horrible event. And then B, it's ignorance and the sort of bubble that people are in when they're not really keyed in. Sometimes we on the left make the mistake of thinking everybody knows what we know. They just don't care. Everyone sees what we see. They're just horrible people and they don't get it, or they'll never get it. And we have to write them off. And I got news for you. The level of just non-information that people have because of the algorithms that feed them cat pictures and brunch pictures and things that have nothing to do with politics because that's what they're into. And we act like they're horrible people when in fact, a lot of them would probably listen to us and probably be horrified by some of these things if they simply knew them.
Yeah. But I think the part that's been sort of surprising is the speed by which they were able to capitalize on this moment, this horrific moment, as you say. Yeah. It's like, if you didn't know better, you would say it was planned. You know what I mean? It's like, it's to that level. Like within hours, there was a script. The script was across the board. Everybody was online. The flags were half staff. The president was out talking. That's the part that always kind of really surprises me about how the right does this.
Well, in a sense, they did have a plan. That's the whole thing. Project 2025, they said, here's what we're going to do. And then all they got to do is figure out, it's almost like a puzzle. Like, okay, when this happens, then we're going to slate this in. They're going to put this piece in the puzzle. We're ready. We know the piece we're missing. And now we have the opportunity, and this is one of the things that I think sometimes the left doesn't do nearly as well, which is prepare for the things that you just know are going to happen. And I'm not saying that I want us to exploit tragedy that way. I think there's something deeply unethical about it. But I do think we have to be better about not just reacting to events. They weren't just reacting. They were ready to do these things. And they knew, like, when this happens, or when not that, but if anything that happens that we can then thumb through this 925 page, whatever it is, document, Project 2025, and oh my gosh, here's our opportunity. We'll go after the broadcast licenses. That's in there. They're talking about that in Project 2025, dealing with, media that isn't fair enough to the president or is too biased. They've been wanting to do that. Then all of a sudden, Jimmy Kimmel makes this innocuous comment. Stephen Colbert, they go after, and it's all very planned, and it's all very clear that they're using. I mean, Jimmy Kimmel's comment was not, I've listened to it 3 or 4 times. The first time I heard about it, before I actually listened to it, I thought what he had said was, this guy was MAGA, and they're trying to act like he's of the left. And I thought, well, okay, it may be an incorrect statement, a wrong statement, but it certainly shouldn't be a fireable offense. But then when you go listen to it, he didn't even say that. No. All he was saying was, these are folks who wanted so hard, they were so desperate immediately to make sure that everybody knew it wasn't one of them. And even the governor of Utah, right, said, I prayed that it was not one of ours. And he didn't mean conservatives. He just meant Utahns. He meant maybe Mormons. I don't know. But there were others who were so quick, before there was any evidence at all, to know who it was or why it was, they were desperate to say it was us, we on the left, whatever that means. And of course, to Stephen Miller, that means anything to the left of Joe Lieberman, I guess, back in the day, or anybody to the left of, Bob Dole, or wants to outlaw the Democratic Party, basically. So all Kimmel was saying was, you guys couldn't even wait till the evidence was in, but they twisted it and they used it. And of course, they've been planning on using it. So what it teaches us is that the other side, they've gamed this thing out, 5 or 6 moves. And it's not, Trump is not a chess player. Trump's a clown. But the people at Heritage Foundation, they are not clowns. They are chess players. They know exactly what they're doing. And I think sometimes we don't know how to play that game, and we better learn how to do it pretty quickly.
Yeah, I was wondering, like, if something similar was to happen on the left, and can you imagine, like, someone like Biden or Obama or someone like that saying, let's fly the flags at half staff, and let's make sure that we have a moment of silence in Congress, and let's make sure everybody comes out on the, in front of a memorial, and anyone that speaks ill of this person in any way, shape, or form, not even ill, just not lionize him, as you say, right, would be canceled. I mean, they would have gone berserk. Now, why?
Let me give you an example, if I could, of that.
Why are we going berserk? I don't get it.
And I don't want to in any way compare myself in terms of my level of influence to Charlie Kirk, because he's far more influential than me. But I was targeted for death by the Terrorgram Collective, which is this international white supremacist terrorist group that the leaders were arrested under the last couple months of the Biden administration in September of 2024, thankfully. But I was on a hit list, as were several other officials, a couple of federal judges, a U.S. senator, a mayor of a major city. I don't know that I'm at liberty to say who, because the cases are going on. But I was one of the people targeted for death. These were people who had a kill card with my name, my address, a picture of my home, information about my family, my phone number, all of that. And they were essentially soliciting my murder, saying to anyone who would kill me, if you do this, you will gain sainthood in the pantheon of white supremacist heroes, or whatever. Now, luckily, that network was disrupted by the FBI. Thank God Trump's FBI wasn't in, because Kash Patel would have been like, we don't need to investigate those people at all. We don't need to infiltrate them. Let them do because they've actually pulled back now from all the sort of work around right-wing extremism. But thankfully, at that time, it was Biden's DOJ, and they were investigating. I had received multiple sort of need to know. I had FBI agents actually come to my home on 2 occasions to give me duty to warn notifications. When they finally arrested those people, I thought to myself, number one, if it's Trump's DOJ, I could easily have been killed, as could some of these other targets, because they wouldn't have disrupted the network. And I guarantee you that if that had happened, yeah, first of all, probably nobody would have said, let's have a day of remembrance for Tim Wise, because I ain't that important. But if someone had even gotten up on the floor of the Congress and had a resolution condemning the attack, I guarantee you that there would be people on the right who would be like, oh, but this guy was this lefty, critical race theorist, radical. And you know what? Here's the thing. If that had happened to me, and I'm glad it didn't, and God forbid it ever does in the future, but if it had, I would expect people to debate what it is I believed. I wouldn't expect that just the fact that I'd been murdered, and that's obviously wrong, and I've been murdered by Nazis, would automatically mean that everybody should lionize me. I would hope that even out of that tragedy, people would be like, well, what did he believe in? And I would hope that people would like what I believed in. But the idea that we shouldn't even have a conversation about it, that we shouldn't discuss it. I know that right wingers would be dragging up every sort of outrageous. I mean, we all have said outrageous things on social media that we sort of regret the tone that we took. I'm sure they'd be taking every single thing like that I ever said and making a big deal out of it. But they act like we can't do that with Charlie Kirk, whose record speaks for itself in terms of the animosities, the hatreds that he had in the name of his Christian nationalist, pseudo white nationalist, or at least, pretty borderline white nationalist politic.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the whole idea, of Trump even coming in was all about like, we can't have cancel culture. Cancel culture is wrong and all this. And now it's being reversed. And of course, they're canceling pretty much everything in sight. And speaking of canceling, I mean, DEI was his first target, right? I mean, It was this immediately from the get-go, DEI was going to be next. And I mean, thousands of people lost their jobs. Companies are falling over themselves to redefine themselves and get rid of DEI. I'm trying to understand. DEI is an initiative, right? I mean, it's not. I mean, the laws were already there about diversity and inclusion and equity. They were already in place, right? That's what the EOC is for. That's what other agencies are for. What is the big deal with DEI for the other side, and they want to remove it? Why is that?
Fundamentally, these are people who, and their statements make it very clear, they fundamentally believe that, and Darren Beatty, who is the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs at the State Department, has actually said that he was appointed that by the Trump administration. He's also the head of the United States Peace Institute or whatever, Institute of Peace. He's actually on record as of last fall. He had a tweet that went out that said, you have to have competent white men in charge if you want things to work. That's somebody who works for the administration being paid by our tax dollars. That is their mentality. Their belief is that essentially all the efforts to diversify the workforce, to expand opportunity in the zone of opportunity for people who had been historically marginalized and kept out of opportunity, that all of those things amounted to essentially displacing the naturally superior white and male leadership. And so they have turned DEI, and started to do this even before Trump's reelection, into this sort of catch-all for anything that goes wrong. You just blame people of color, because we know white men, when white men were running things, nothing ever went wrong, ever in American history, is essentially what they're saying. And so if you think about some of the things they tried to blame on DEI as a way to demonize equal opportunity efforts, because that's all DEI efforts are. They're just simply about making sure that institutional spaces in the public and private sector, in colleges and universities and companies and government are treating folks equitably, that the barriers to participation and inclusion are reduced. And sometimes you got to look into that. You got to study that. You got to examine that. You got to train people on how to make sure the barriers are gone. But to them, that was unjust. And so they started blaming everything. Think about a few of the things. When the LA fires were raging, what'd they say? Oh, it's not the Santa Ana winds, and it's not dry vegetation. It's not, certainly not climate change. It's the fact that the LA Fire Department was run by someone who I guess is a lesbian. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I think that was the argument. And they were too focused on DEI, and the mayor, Karen Bass, too focused on DEI, and therefore they didn't fill up the fire hydrants. Okay, 2 points. Number one, no reason that you can't fill up fire hydrants and also do DEI. Number two, you cannot put out raging wildfires that are scorching entire mountains worth of vegetation with a fire hydrant. So it's not even a logical argument. But that was a way to say, see, DEI, as Elon Musk said, is equals DIE, because he's obviously very clever. They then proceeded to blame when the Boeing, I think it was an Alaska Airlines jet, had a door blow out mid-flight a couple of years back. And they said, oh, it's the DEI program at Boeing. It's the DEI program at the airlines that caused that to happen. Well, what does that even mean? They started talking about programs, DEI programs for pilots and how that's going to get people. But pilots don't, like weld the doors onto the planes. I've spoken at Boeing Machinist Union, I think it's 751 in Seattle, that does that. I'm going to tell you, it's a lot of white dudes, big white dudes. It's not black women running the Machinist Union. It's a bunch of white dudes. So it's not black people's fault, brown people's fault, women's fault that the doors ain't working. So, but they tried to make it about that because that's a way to scare people. The Baltimore Bridge, Francis Scott Key Bridge, got hit by that barge a couple years ago, right? Or last year, whatever it was. And what they do, they said, oh, it's the DEI mayor. And what does that even mean to be a DEI mayor? A mayor got elected. So by definition, it's not a DEI. He got the most votes, but because he's a black male, see, we'll just call him DEI. So DEI became the new N-word for people on the right. And they've used it to the crash in DC in January, right after the inauguration, and you have the helicopter. It was an Army or Navy, whatever it was, a helicopter that crashed with the jet. And turns out it was a faulty either altimeter or whatever it is that figures out the altitude, right? But they blamed it on DEI. It's DEI. They're hiring people to be air traffic controllers who have intellectual disabilities and are people of color. And of course, that's not true. None of that critique was true, but it was a way to essentially say, hey, white people, whenever anything goes wrong, to the extent that there are people of color in the picture at all, to the extent there are women in the picture, we can just blame it on them. And here's why it works. Well, first, I should say, it's very important to note, no court decision in the history of the country has ever found that DEI is illegal, but they keep referring to illegal DEI. That's the executive orders refer to that. Their statements in public from the administration refer to that. There is no such thing as illegal DEI. Not one DEI policy has been found illegal. Now, some folks would say, and they would, well, that's not true. Supreme Court decision in the Harvard and UNC affirmative action case, but that is a very limited decision. It applies only to a very particular way of doing admissions and only in higher ed. It doesn't say anything about DEI in higher ed, which normally affirmative action and DEI aren't even the same. Affirmative action is a very specific tool used for very specific purposes. DEI is this catch-all that includes everything from training on implicit bias to training on making sure that there's no racial harassment to, there's just a number of things that get done in colleges and private sector corporations and government, and none of that was implicated in the decision. But what's happening, despite the fact that the SFFA, Students for Fair Admissions decision, didn't implicate any of that, what the administration is doing is using that decision to intimidate colleges, universities, private companies into getting rid of everything. So you've got colleges shutting down multicultural affairs departments. There's no ruling that says that's necessary. And in fact, if you look at the Supreme Court decision and you read even the words of the majority that outlawed one particular way of doing affirmative action, you would realize that they're still giving leeway for other types of diversity efforts. But it's being lied about in a way that everyone thinks, well, oh, we can't have a multicultural affairs department. We can't have a diversity department. We can't have any of these sort of special events that are focused on identity of different groups. There's no court decision. They're simply complying with this in spite of no rule requiring them to do so, because they are too afraid to stand up to the racist and pseudo-fascist machinations of this administration. It's important to realize the reason it works, though, is because there's so much misunderstanding about what DEI is, and especially for white people. And I've been involved now in 2 cases as an expert witness defending DEI efforts and affirmative action efforts from lawsuits that were brought by white plaintiffs that were complaining about, this is reverse discrimination or whatever. By the way, we won both of those suits. But one of the things that I thought was interesting in these claims that were made by these white plaintiffs, they were essentially arguing anything you do to try to diversify is by definition injurious to me. You know, anything you do to diversify or include other people who otherwise have been excluded, that's an injury to me. And on the one hand, there's part of me that just wants to say, oh, give me a break, right? But here's the thing that I came to appreciate when I was working on my expert briefs for these cases and doing a little research on it. You begin to realize, and it's just like the Charlie Kirk thing, you think that everybody knows what you know. You think that everybody's seen what you see. But what I found fascinating, the research is clear, not only that the vast majority of white folks have never, ever had to really contemplate the ongoing systemic exclusion of people of color, and men have never really had to contemplate the ongoing systemic exclusion of women in certain spaces. So that when you say we've got to make these special efforts for those groups, if you've never even thought about how they continue to be marginalized, if you don't understand how they continue to be marginalized, however hard that is for some people to believe that you wouldn't, a lot of people don't. If you don't know that, then yeah, you're going to think, well, why are you making this special effort for them? Right? And if you're making a special effort for them, you're ignoring me. Well, what we were able to effectively argue was, what I tried to argue was, hey, I can understand as an expert in this field why these plaintiffs feel that they were marginalized, but here's why they're wrong, right? Here's why I think that's the result of having been protected. It's the irony of white privilege, right? The irony of being privileged is that you haven't had to actually consider the world and the institutions that you're part of from somebody else's perspective. And then when I ask you or somebody else asks you to do that, you sort of get back on your heels like, whoa, what is this? I'm being attacked. As opposed to realizing, oh, privilege actually made you so thin-skinned and unaware that now any conversation that makes race salient in your life seems like an attack. And I want to be both sympathetic to that because the system created that ignorance, but I also want to push back on it. And that's what we have to do right now in this moment.
Yeah, it's great because, I mean, it's similar to the Black Lives Matter movement where white people were saying, well, that means I don't matter. And again, I'm not in the front of the line, and therefore there must be some sort of problem with inequity.
That's exactly right.
It's a constant thing, I think, that happens. And it's also, I think, using, for instance, this acronyms, where it's DEI, that becomes the big thing. People talk about DEI, DEI, DEI. If you tell them, do you want a fair workspace, they may be fine with that. It's similar to Obamacare versus the Affordable Care Act. If you tell them you want healthcare to be affordable, yes, we love it. Obamacare, no way, because it has the name Obama attached to it.
That's
right.
So
that's the constant thing. You also write, I think, which I think a lot of people don't understand necessarily and don't realize, the idea that white privilege creates mediocrity. It creates conditions where, we don't really do our best. We don't really excel. We don't really go beyond what is comfortable and easy for us. And I think that's an important point that people need to hear about.
Yeah. I mean, anytime you have a system that where certain people just aren't allowed to compete equitably, by definition, you are sacrificing merit and the search for merit. So the irony of this argument that the right makes, and Charlie Kirk used to make this argument in a very, I think, tacky way. He would say, I want people to be chosen on the basis of their merit, not their color. Yeah, me too. And every black person I ever knew says that. And every person of color I ever know says that. The problem is, number one, historically, we obviously didn't do it that way. We chose people based on their whiteness and excluded everybody else. And still too often today, according to literally all the research, that still too often happens. It doesn't always happen the same way that it used to, though it sometimes does. A lot of times it just happens through old boys networks, who you know, not what you know. We know from the research, and just common sense tells you too, that the vast majority of the people in the best networks for jobs are going to be white males with income that's upper middle class or above. And that means, they're going to recommend their friends. They're going to recommend the people they know, the people that live in their neighborhood, that maybe go to church with them, that their kids go to school with the other person's kids. And unfortunately, because of spatial isolation, historical segregation, our networks tend to be pretty, in many cases, racially isolated. So even a non-racist, well, there's no such thing, but even someone who isn't overtly racist, let's say, and means well, if they're recommending their buddies for jobs and they don't know any black people, they don't know any people of color, they just know they're white dudes that they hang out with and go to Buffalo Wild Wings with or whatever, that's going to mean lack of equal opportunity. And more than that, it's going to mean less merit, because unless you assume that, Chip over there in the accounting department just so happens to live on the same cul-de-sac as the most qualified people to work with him in Chip's company, which seems mathematically unlikely to me. Odds are there's somebody outside of Chip's little world that might be better. But unless you assume that all the white folks that are already in the system know all the next best people, you should automatically think to yourself, man, what are we missing when we don't do DEI? We're getting this narrow casted understanding of merit, of talent. Now Chip's buddy might be okay for the next opening in the company, but is it necessarily the best one? Well, how do you know unless you expand the frame and bring people in who otherwise would be overlooked? So the idea that affirmative action and DEI sacrifice merit is actually the inverse of the truth. It's only when you do these things and expand the number of people that are able to run the race that you're actually able to find out who the fastest runner is. Otherwise, you're just dealing with the same people that had the head start, and you're assuming, well, you had a 5-lap head start and you hit the tape first, so I guess you're the fastest. If you have a 5-lap head start, you should hit the tape first. That's sort of how it works. It doesn't mean that you're the fastest runner.
Yeah, I also always thought that DEI, the whole initiative DEI, was kind of strange. I mean, the way it was presented, it was like an add-on. It's okay. You have this company now. Now we got to add DEI. We'll have a DEI department, and that will kind of be there. And because it was an add-on, kind of like a little appendage to whatever it is, it was easy to just break off and get rid of. If DEI was really coming from the top and really infused in the company, you wouldn't be talking about DEI. You wouldn't be talking about this one-off where, you can actually just break it off and say, we don't have it anymore. That's right.
It would just be part of the normative corporate culture.
That's the odd part about it, how quickly people remove DEI. Like, how do you remove DEI? If you asked me to remove DEI from my company, I don't know what that would look like. Like, I would have, because everybody isn't mixed, we don't have white people in one corner, black people in another corner.
If they were to do that to you, you might as well remove electricity from your bookstore. I mean, it's just like it's part of what you just do every day. And what we saw after the uprising in 2020 was a lot of companies that, let's be honest, they had never really done this with any deliberate intentionality, rushing to do it, not because they necessarily had an epiphany about racial injustice in America, but because they understood there was money to be made. And so all of a sudden you had everybody rolling out their DEI stuff. You had all, and they were worried about lawsuits too, but I think they also just PR. It was PR. And as soon as the worm turned, so to speak, and as soon as the backlash set in, then they put their finger in the wind and they said, oh, it's blowing the other way. So now we're going to get rid of this. And now to their credit, there are companies that have not done that. And I appreciate that. But most of the ones that haven't done that are the ones who were already doing this work before 2020. They were people who understood this is how you get excellence in your institution. The ones that only did it after 2020 were looking for money, and now they think there's more money to be made by being hostile to it. And I guess we'll see whether or not that's true, but that is where I think they're coming from. And even before the Trump administration Trump 2.0, in the couple of years, last 2 years of the Biden administration, there were already like 2,500 DEI positions that were eliminated by those same private companies in America that had previously expanded them. So it was so temporary. And what's so ironic about that is we act like the right wing, which is so angry about DEI, acted like this was some deeply entrenched system of racial spoils, when really it was a very shallow attempt. And what's horrible for some of us who do this work is we were all sort of cynical about DEI efforts. Like I was historically, I've been doing this for a long time. And I remember I had a speech that for years was the title of it was Beyond Diversity, because I used to make fun of diversity as a concept. And, this whole DEI concept to me was very slick, very much about marketing, very much about, I used to have companies that would call my agent and they would say, we want to bring him in, but we want him to make the business case for diversity. Well, I think there's a business case to be made for diversity, but what we see in the last couple of years is if that's all you hang your hat on, if there's no ethical imperative, if there's no understanding of the need for this beyond that, the other side can put enough pressure on you to where the business case doesn't stand up anymore. And so I would always tell them, I'm not doing that. I remember speaking to Ford Motor Company in 99, and at 99, I was 30, almost 31 when I went in. And I remember standing in front of this room full of older white dudes with white hair, which is now me, but at the time I was young. And I remember, my hair doesn't look too white on this street, but it is white. And I remember standing up and saying, listen, I know you guys might want, well, yeah, I said, I know you guys might want me to talk about how diversity efforts, might, and racial equity efforts might make you a lot of money. I said, I don't know. You're a multi-billion-dollar company. I got about $79 in the bank. So you hired the wrong guy if you're looking for somebody to tell you how to make money. But I can tell you why this is imperative for excellence and for Justice Reed, both moral reasons and practical reasons. But I don't know how to tell you it's going to make you money. And they all were like, oh, because they wanted the other thing. So I think we just have to, we have to understand that what really all of it boils down to is you have people in this country who have never accepted the full inclusion of marginalized peoples as full and equal citizens. And they have been planning, and this is not meant as a conspiracy theory, but they have been planning and plotting since Appomattox, when Lee surrendered after the Civil War, at the end of the Civil War, figure out, and they overthrew Reconstruction. And after Brown v. Board in 1954, they started figuring out how are we going to rebel against this? And they figured out a way to do it. And it was school choice. Most people don't realize that the school choice movement comes out of the reaction of the right to Brown v. Board. Milton Friedman writes a piece in 1955 talking about vouchers and school choice. Milton Friedman didn't just fall off the economics turnip truck that year. He'd been an economist for a minute. He'd never written about that. And all of a sudden, after Brown v. Board, he's like, we got to have some school choice to let people choose where to send their kids. That was never an issue, apparently, until you could no longer segregate schools. So we have to understand the historic arc of backlash and understand how that historic arc of, and Carol Anderson writes about this in her brilliant book, White Rage. Every step forward toward racial justice, particularly for Black people, has been met by this concomitant white backlash or white rage. And sometimes it's overt violence, yes, but a lot of times it's systemic violence, it's public policy, it's these efforts by people in positions of power to reassert their dominance. They told us they were going to do it. They told us it was what they were about, and we have been asleep in a sense. I think many liberals and people of, progressive, maybe not the left, but liberals and progressives who figured like, after Obama, we've reached this post-racial moment, or maybe not post-racial, but at least we're headed on the right track. And, we're never going to be taken back to the pre-civil rights days. And these folks are like, oh yeah, hold my beer, because actually we're coming for all of it. And so the fact that we're now going to be lionizing Charlie Kirk and having a day of remembrance for him, apparently, according to the congressional vote today,
yes, on the 13th of October.
Yeah. October 14th, because it's his birthday, we're going to be having a day of remembrance for a guy who said that maybe the single greatest piece of legislation that has been passed in this country, certainly in the last 60 years or so, and one of the most in American history, the Civil Rights Act, which is the culmination of all the civil rights stuff that we've seen, the footage from Dr. King and Birmingham and all of that. That's how we got the Civil Rights Act. And this guy said, that was sort of a bad thing. We probably shouldn't have done that. And that's who we're going to be lionizing. That's just how far back we are capable of going if we're not careful.
Are we seeing a second kind of backlash to Reconstruction? This is what it feels like. It feels like there is this moment where we're seeing some Reconstruction happening, and now there's this break now that's going to take us back. Are we back to Jim Crow? I mean, it seems like it's heading in that direction, right?
It's it's always going to have to be updated and repackaged, because we never go. There's a statement: history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. I think a better one is like history doesn't repeat, but it does raid its own costume closet, right? So
Right,
it puts on the
You say
same
that.
garb.
Yeah.
It puts on the same garb of what it's done before. And I think in this case, yes, this is an assault on the second Reconstruction, or maybe the third, if we were to say, you know, the original Reconstruction's the first one, maybe Brown v. Board and desegregation's the second one, maybe affirmative action to the present is the third one, whatever. It's certainly more like that than anything else. And I think the mistake, even in this moment, that too many people have made, and I mean progressive people, is when we talk about the Trump regime as fascist, for instance, and we're using that term more. And I think there's a lot to recommend that term if you actually understand the history of fascism, keeping in mind, you know, that Hitler actually borrowed from American race policy for his own version of fascism. Too often, people, including scholars of fascism, and I should say specifically white scholars of fascism, look for the analog of the current moment anywhere but here. And so we say, well, this is like Germany, 1933, or maybe 32. This is like Italy, 1925. It may or may not be, but I tell you what it is. It is definitely like the United States of America in 1877. I can tell you that for sure. It is like the beginning of the end of Reconstruction, when the planter class began to reassert itself and try to figure out how to do two things. How do we disempower the upstart black politicians who have invaded these state legislatures and are corrupt and need to be run out? That was the narrative, right? The birth of a nation narrative. And remember what else they did? They attacked the teaching of accurate history, and they created the lost cause narrative about the Civil War. That's the exact same thing that this administration is doing by trying to strip museums of accurate historical reflection, erase things from historic sites, ban books from schools and libraries, right? So we don't have to look to Germany. We don't have to look to Italy. And in fact, sometimes when we use that example, it doesn't land because people are like, oh, we're never going to be like the Nazis. Putting aside whether we could or could not be, we don't have to say, are we going to be like the Nazis? Let's just talk about, are we going to be like the post-Reconstruction, quote unquote, redeemers who reestablished white supremacy for decades, for generations, that brought us back to what Doug Blackman calls, you know, slavery by another name, where essentially the system of enslavement was reestablished in everything but name in terms of the disempowerment of black people. So the idea that fascism is this foreign thing, that it's this thing that only other people do. If you look at the elements of fascism, the administration is doing them, but it is something that black folks have known all throughout American history. It isn't new to them. And so what we need to learn to do is to listen to black folks, which is why the attack on history and accurate teaching of history is so critical to this administration. Because if they can remove the narratives of black people, not just get black people out of the jobs they're in, not just get black people out of the schools that they gained access to, that's part of it. But more importantly, we got to take the story away. Because if we can take the narrative away, then those young people won't even realize that we're doing the same thing that our ancestors did by removing these rights. If you take out the story, people, it's sort of like see no evil, hear about no evil, therefore you can remedy no evil, right? If you don't know about the evil and you don't hear about the evil, then you can't understand the parallels between that evil and what's going on today. So it's a very sophisticated and pernicious attempt to eliminate not just opportunities, but the narratives we need to understand why we still have to push for those opportunities.
There's a video of you in the African American Museum that I'm on as well. Is that still there, as far as you know?
I doubt it. I would be stunned to learn that is still there. You know, it was funny after that happened when Lonnie Bunch brought me in to be interviewed for that. It was such an honor, and it was also bizarre because, like, it's the it's the Museum of African American History and Culture, and here's this white guy at the very end. You know, it's like Obama's on that thing. You know, it's like, and there I am, this white guy saying, I don't even remember what I said. It's something about color blindness is something white folks made up, so we didn't have to deal with racism. It's some snarky, smart ass comment like that, and I'm sure if it is still there, it ain't gonna be there long.
Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up.
I probably shouldn't have. My kids, of course, when they did their 8th grade trips to DC, it was very exciting for them to have their classmates go through. And it's like, oh my God, isn't that your dad? So it was an honor to be part of it. I don't know that I'll be part of it for long, but more importantly, forget me. That was just a nice little thing for me in my life. The bigger thing is, are we going to be able to keep, will the auction block from which human beings were sold be allowed to remain? Or if it is, will we have to put a poster up that says, oh, but we got rid of this, and there was also slavery in other places? And well, no kidding. Of course, there's injustice in lots of places, but this is a museum about the Black experience. Is Emmett Till's casket going to be able to stay there? Or are they going to say, oh, that's going to make white people feel bad because, it'll make them remember that white people killed the guy? What concerns me about that attack on the museum is this idea that we have to sanitize the harsher parts of our history in order to honor our history. What I find so empowering about that museum is that, and the way it's laid out, as you well know, and anybody that's been in it, the brilliance of it is that it is, if you actually go through it and pay attention, it is the ultimate story of hard work, individual initiative, collective initiative, and meritocracy, and overcoming obstacles. All the stuff the right wing says they want people to honor, that museum honors it, because you start out in the bottom level, very low ceilings, very dark, meant to sort of mimic the slave ship, right? That's where you're starting, is the middle passage. And then you come up level by level by level. It increasingly gets lighter and lighter and lighter. And you're learning about the resistance. And when I realized that, when I thought about that, I thought, this isn't a depressing museum. This isn't a museum that says, oh, everything that Black folks have experienced has been horrible. It's an incredibly empowering narrative. And that's when it hit me. What these people are actually mad about, it ain't the oppression part. They'll tell us that's what, it's so sad. It's all the horribles of slavery. And then but it ain't the oppression they're worried about. What they don't want people seeing is the resistance to the oppression. It's not the oppression. It's the resistance.
Second and third floor is the
overcoming. It's the overcoming part they're upset about. The oppression part never bothered them. The overcoming part is what bothers them. And that's why they want that narrative out of there.
Absolutely. They want to rewrite that the Middle Passage was a transatlantic cruise, and make it into something not as bad as it really was.
That's right.
Because we don't want to make white people feel uncomfortable going through the museum. God forbid. God forbid. Did you? I wanted to ask you, did you think it would be this bad?
I did. I maybe didn't think it would be this bad this fast. They have moved very, very quickly. But that's the thing, right? When you don't really have any reticence about breaking traditions, like the thing about historically Democrats and Republicans, even very conservative Republicans, is they sort of had this commitment to institutionalism and sort of the basic guardrails of what we consider American democracy. So even Reagan had that, as bad as he was. Even Nixon, well, sort of, he pushed the guardrails, but nobody really ever tried to do but Donald Trump, precisely because he doesn't come from that world of public service, quite the opposite. He comes from the world of Donald Trump service. He comes from the world of my family is all that matters. I'm all that matters, that narcissistic world. And I mean, look, anybody that thinks they're good enough to be president has to be a little narcissistic. Be honest, like to think that you're all that. But Donald Trump's like, sort of clinical in a sense. And so that guy comes in and says, I don't care about the traditions. I don't care about the guardrails. I don't really care about the Constitution, except for the article that gives me all of this, what I think to be unlimited power, because I, didn't really read the Constitution. I don't understand that I'm just one part of the government. But when you come in with no scruples and no real ethical guidance, and you believe, l'état c'est moi, you believe that the state is you and you are the state, then yeah, man, you can do incredible damage very fast. And when you've got, a guy like Stephen Kirk, Nazi Ferratu, as your right-hand man, your Roy Cohn, as he's always looked for, who is, just still is, it's just detested brown people since he was a kid at Santa Monica High School, I suppose, because his family was, not as rich as some. He felt like the poor Jewish kid in Santa Monica, And I grew up the poor Jewish kid in the temple that I went to in Nashville, Tennessee, but I didn't become a fascist because of it. So I don't know what happened to him. But when you got guys like that, yeah, man, they'll come in and break things fast. So that has surprised me a little bit, not what they're doing, but the rapidity. And what has really surprised me is the pre-compliance of so many institutions, so many colleges and universities, so many law firms, so many people targeted by this administration, the networks capitulating because they want to get their mergers approved. It's absolutely dispiriting. Not that I knew what he was going to try to do. I just thought that people would have a spine. And I guess I was overestimating other people, not underestimating him, overestimating other people.
I think the one thing they threw in there, which is brilliant on their part, is the idea of anti-Semitism, how they weaponized anti-Semitism for a much larger agenda that they have, which is white supremacy.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about how that whole idea of anti-Semitism is now playing into the universities and taking away cancer research money and other things that you would think that have nothing to do with that because some Jewish students felt uncomfortable or somebody is being targeted as being anti-Semitic, whatever. Can you talk
and some of that cancer research being done by Jewish scientists and scholars, but now they're going to lose their contracts because of that. First off, for Donald Trump to act like, the avatar of Judeophilia, that he loves Jews. This is a guy who, speaks about Jews only being good for counting his money in his casinos or whatever. A guy who has, he actually spoke to a group of Jews, I think during his first term, and referred to Benjamin Netanyahu as our prime minister. No, he's the prime minister of Israel. He's not our prime minister unless you start with the assumption that we're not really Americans, which is what Donald Trump is in fact saying.
Well, somebody said that Benjamin Netanyahu is the worst American president we've ever had.
Yeah, absolutely. He's terrible. Absolutely. Or at least the worst senator from New York that we've ever had. But yes, I think that to give him credit is caring about Jews. When he says those kinds of things about Jews is obviously preposterous and disingenuous. What I think has been disturbing about this last couple of months is this notion of anti-Semitism on campus. I'm not saying there aren't anti-Semites. I'm Jewish. I've been dealing with anti-Semitism since I was a kid, growing up in Nashville, Tennessee, one of, 7 or 8 Jewish kids in my public school, constantly being told by teachers that I was going to be going to hell because I wasn't a Christian. And I've never heard any of these right-wing people say anything about that. Like you want to talk about anti-Semitism. How do you suck up to people? How do Jewish people suck up to right-wing evangelicals who are convinced that their soul is destined for a lake of fire? Like, what level of self-hatred? And then I realized, well, the level of self-hatred is that, sadly, we in the American Jewish community too often have essentially substituted Israel for any actual cultural connection or historical connection to Judaism. We are not being Jewish, we are being Zionist, and that is not the same thing. And I think part of what we as Jews have to do, and this is why what Hannah Einbinder did the other day at the Emmys was so important, even though it was just a moment in time. But it's like for her as a Jewish woman to say, this ain't us. What's going on in Gaza, this is not us. This is not Judaism. This is a bastardization of Judaism. And how dare other Jews and these Shanda Jews, as sort of a Yiddish word for shameful, these Shanda Jews and these Gentiles tell us what anti-Semitism is. You're gonna define. Jonathan Greenblatt at the ADL is going to tell us that essentially any substantive criticism of Israel that goes beyond. I mean, he'll say things like, it's okay to criticize Netanyahu, but if you criticize the fundamental underpinnings of Israel, you're an anti-Semite. I've never heard Jonathan Greenblatt condemn Netanyahu. I'd love to hear that. I'd love to hear what his criticism, his acceptable level of criticism is. But more importantly, the idea that you can't criticize Zionism without being an anti-Semite is fascinating to me, because until World War II, the vast majority of Jews were not, in fact, committed to any form of political Zionism. Albert Einstein opposed political Zionism. He was a cultural Zionist, and he said so. But when they wanted him to be the first president of Israel, he said, I'm not into that, because he believed in Zionism culturally, a connection culturally to the land of Israel, Palestine, but he did not believe that there ought to be an ethno-state, an ethno-religious state that was specifically the state of the Jewish people. And he wasn't alone in that. The majority of my great-grandfather, who escaped from Russia in the early 20th century, did not want to go to Palestine. He wanted to come to the United States. He was a member of the Bund. He was a member of the Workers' Circle, which was, a socialist labor formation, essentially. He believed in universalism. Most Jews did. So if being against Zionism makes you anti-Semitic, that's like saying most Jews until the Shoah, until after the Holocaust, were anti. That doesn't make any sense. You can argue, maybe some would, that it's naive to be anti-Zionist now. You can make that argument. We could debate that for hours and days and weeks, but you can't say it's anti-Semitic because it was the majority opinion in American Judaism. It was actually the opinion of the American Jewish Committee. They were not committed to Zionism in the early days. They had a very Zionism critical position. That switched, but you can't just say, well, we can now do these things because Hitler. Because Hitler is not the answer to everything that happens. It can't be. We have to say, no, actually, that experience, what Hitler did, and the history of the pogroms and the history of violence against our people is precisely why we're not going to do this to other people. We have to demand that. And unfortunately, with someone like Trump playing that fiddle and trying to convince Jews that he loves us, and he doesn't love us. In fact, a lot of these right-wing people would just love for us all to go to Israel so we wouldn't be here anymore, to be honest. I mean, I think, yeah, they want us, they want to love Israel so we'll all make Aliyah and go there, and then we won't bother them as they build their white Christian nationalist empire. It's incredibly hypocritical, it's offensive, and it's fundamentally anti-Semitic because it says that in order to be a good Jew, you have to have this, this particular set of ideas. It's just nonsensical.
And we're almost out of time. We have a couple more minutes, but I wanted to finish by asking you, I know we started about talking about Project 2025 and how it's a huge, I think it's a 700-page manual, basically, that gives them, immediately, the marching orders, the templates that they need when something comes up. Is there something right now that you're aware of that's being worked on by the left, similarly, that can actually have a plan, a blueprint?
I don't know if there's anything
for the way out of this.
I don't know if there's anything that comprehensive, and I don't know that we necessarily need that. I think that where the left falls short is not so much in what we might call the logos, right? If you think logos, ethos, pathos, those old terms, the logos is sort of the ideas, the policy ideas, the intellectual sort of ideological framing. I think we can do a decent job of that, but we're not always as good with the pathos, the storytelling. What makes the right so effective is they know how to tell a good story, and a lot of times what we get caught up in is the policy specific. So here's our 10-point plan to improve, this or this. We're going to bring broadband internet to the rural communities, or here's our healthcare plan. And yeah, we got to have those things, but we also got to be able to talk to people about where they are, meet them where they are. And most of where they are is not at the grad level seminar. They're not policy wonks. Most people are not going to sit and look over policy plans. Most people didn't look over Project 2025. Project 2025 was not for public consumption. It was for internal consumption by the people that were going to build out the architecture of this administration. What they did to get elected was sell a story. They sold a story about what was hurting America and who was hurting America. And so what we've got to get back, we got to have our plans. We got to be ready if we ever have a chance to obtain power again. But in order to get to a place where we can even institute those things, we've got to learn how to speak to people where they are. And that means less, sort of academic theory and analysis, and a lot more just reaching out to people, meeting them where they are, acknowledging that sometimes we don't use language which is accessible to people because we're so caught up in the policy stuff and the specifics, and we're often in our heads. And a lot of people, that's not where they're at. And there's nothing wrong with that. We have to be able to meet folks where they are and tell them why progressivism and a justice liberatory politics is best for everyone.
Well, I think that's a good spot to end. I really appreciate your time, Tim. Thank you so much. Tim Wise, author, activist, educator, and writes a lot about anti-racism. Please look him up. Author of many, many books. Thank you so much for joining us. And this is a conversation that can go on for much longer. We'll have to have you on again. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thanks.